In this video, we will be discussing the difference between the multiplication and division properties and when it is appropriate to use each one. Similar to the addition and subtraction properties, we use multiplication and division properties to multiply or divide segments and angles. So here are a few hints as to when it is appropriate to use the multiplication and division properties in two-column proofs. Anytime you see the double use of the words midpoint, bisect, or trisect, that automatically means you should be thinking it is going to be a multiplication or division property to reach the final conclusion, because those words midpoint, bisect, and trisect mean to divide into two or to divide into three even segments or angles. Now my second hint is we use the multiplication property whenever the concluding segments or angles are larger than the given segments or angles. So the reverse of this would be true for the division property. We would use the division property whenever the conclusion is smaller. So whenever the concluding angles or segments are smaller than the given segments or angles. Okay, so let's try some examples of just determining when to use multiplication versus when to use the division property. So our first given is that B and E are midpoints, so notice the double use of the word midpoint, and AC is congruent to DF. So since we cannot make those segments any larger, we can only make them smaller. So you could have multiple different correct statements. So we know that any one of those four segments would be congruent to each other. So we would know that BC is congruent to DE, or AB is congruent to EF. And since we are getting smaller, this would be an example of the division property. Now, do not say that AB and BC are congruent, because that would only be using one of the midpoint givens. You want to make sure that you are using all three of the givens. So that's why you must choose one smaller segment from the left-hand side and then one smaller segment from the right-hand side. Our next example, we have that points OP, S, and T are trisectors. So this is a double use of the word trisects, and we are also given that segment MO is congruent to segment RS. Now we cannot make those segments any smaller, we can only make them larger, so we can say that the entire segment MQ is congruent to the other segment RV. Now since we made those segments larger, we used the multiplication property. So this is an example of both the division property of segments and the multiplication property of segments. In this third example, you see the word bisect twice, so that should immediately indicate that this is going to either be a multiplication or division problem. We are also given angle TWZ is congruent to angle TZW. Now, since we cannot make those angles any smaller, we can double them to get the entire angle, and so we know that the larger angle, XWZ, is congruent to angle YZW by the multiplication property. We went from the smaller angles to the larger angles, so this would be an example of the multiplication property for angles. Now this last example again has the word bisects twice. AD bisects BAC and CD bisects angle BCA. We are also given that angles BAC are congruent to angle BCA. We cannot make those angles any larger, but we know the four smaller angles are therefore congruent since they're both being bisected. So therefore angle BAD would be congruent to angle BCD, and angle DAC would be congruent to angle DCA. We know all four of those angles must be congruent because the larger angles are congruent, and then those larger angles are being bisected. So this would be an example of the division property, since we can make those angles smaller. So now hopefully you should have a better understanding of when to use the multiplication versus the division property.